Hi, everyone. My name is Doreen Dawson. We should be starting in just a moment. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in just a moment.
Hey.
Hey. Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in just a moment. We're just getting everything set up. Thank you for joining us today. And this is set up as a webinar, so I think everyone is muted and you are not on video. There's a few people asking about that, so. Abby, did you want to say anything for welcoming? I wasn't sure.
I'm happy to welcome everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Abby Ingber, the Executive Director of the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder. And we're so happy that you have joined us for our reboot of Module 4. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Eric Ottinger, who is one of our active family connections leaders and also a clinician, and he will be walking us through Module 4. You can use the Q&A feature if you would like to ask any questions. Doreen and I will monitor the questions and we will pose them to Eric at the end of the event. We'll leave some time to answer questions. We'll also be able to answer some questions midway through if it's something that Doreen and I can answer and we don't need to wait for Eric. Also, this is being recorded, although you as an attendee are not on camera or can't be heard. And we will be posting this recording along with all of our other recordings from our Alumni Institute programs on our website. There is a special link for you to view past alumni programs, and we will make sure to send that out to you so that you can access this and other programs. Eric, take it away. Thank you so much.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and add some additional visuals to the screen in the form of some slides. And we are currently doing this, we're calling it Reboot, And so what that means is we're not necessarily going to go through everything as it appears slide by slide as it would within Module 4. There's actually a couple things that I have pulled from previous slides as a way to create some of the foundation. And that, knowing that Module 4 is probably booked for a minimum of 4 hours in total, I'm going to try to highlight several key things within our 90-minute framework for today. So at this point, it looks like we have 165 people engaged in this live and others to see it later on. And so some of you I've met, some of you have not. I am currently leading Family Connections classes. I got introduced to these ideas really first as a clinician, introduced to some of the concepts about emotional regulation over 10 years ago, and initially meeting some DBT clinicians at that time, and have continued to look at these things in terms of how could I learn more and understand more. And Family Connections has really been a wonderful, wonderful place to be able to create this ongoing engagement with these ideas. And so we have this opening slide, making the transition. And so I want to kind of address that first off, that making the transition can make it seem as if this is an event, that we do this. I'd rather start with this saying that this is more like creating an ongoing process, or creating this ongoing transition that at any point in time, any environment that we are a part of could be more or less validating. And also bringing up, before we even get started, please broaden your perspective on this to begin thinking about that you can think about, apply all of this to your friendship environments, your work relationship environments with your neighbors. And that often that can be a really successful training ground, so to speak, of being able to practice these ideas and skills in an environment that can be less challenging. So please feel free to apply this to your kids, your spouse, of course, but also your friends, family, and coworkers. And this will be, another to check in with the type of language that we tend to use, that as two people interact, a transaction is happening. Well, what does that mean? Well, our environment shapes us and influences us in certain ways. And one of the ways that it shapes us and influences us is it serves as a type of feedback loop. And that could be the kind of a feedback loop where it makes it easier to express ourselves honestly, openly, to really feel emotions, to allow those things to be present. And there's also probably much more common that many of us have experienced multitudes of various environments that weren't warm and welcoming to feeling and honestly expressing emotions in that way. So we're going to look at this from the lens of what is happening in a transaction. Part of what's happening is in the transaction, that transaction is either making it more difficult or less difficult to feel and express emotions. So the environment might be very, very quickly, automatically dismissive, saying things like, well, don't think that, don't feel that, don't act that way. It's not that bad. Get over it. Things will be better tomorrow. That can often come from a place of an attempt to be helpful, and may come from a place of loving and caring, and often maybe an instinctive kind of problem solving, of seeing somebody that we care about right in front of us in pain, suffering, and wanting to alleviate that as quickly as possible. So we're going to normalize that is something that probably every single one of us has done repeatedly. And that just being able to recognize sometimes when that's the transactional model that we take, it's not always effective. It doesn't always work to be able to try to jump in, fix, control, problem solve, to instantly alleviate what seems to be wrong from our perspective. And from those of you that have been through this process and you've seen the It's Not About the Nail video, that's a fantastic, very, very brief illustration of how things can go very, very catastrophically wrong very quickly in any conversation if the person is not being understood. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we say transactions. We have the possible opportunity to influence our environment, and recognizing the environment will also influence and shape us. Overall, big picture, before we get into some new content, this is absolutely, I feel like, essential as a way to say, what are we going to anchor this conversation in? How are we going to understand what it is that we're trying to more successfully navigate as a way to get away from, possibly jumping to conclusions and or labeling people's behaviors in ways that can actually make the problem worse. Is that we're trying to understand that at the core, what we're dealing with is what we commonly call emotional dysregulation. And that we all over time learn ways to regulate our emotions. And that we all have influence by our environments on how and when and in what ways to regulate our emotions. So as we start with a core process, so this is going to be the core process with which we then can start to understand some other things. Like, for example, if we go to the left of that, then when people are emotionally dysregulated, one of the things that we really target and hopefully talk about a lot in Family Connections is that as people get emotionally dysregulated, there's a tendency to think differently. In particular, to think more in terms of things are all or nothing, black or white, right or wrong. We can lose the ability to think in nuanced terms and the ability to recognize there's always probably more than one way to see something, more than one way to understand something, more than one way to describe something. So as we get upset and or we deal with other people who get upset, one of the issues that we're going to face is that's going to affect us at a cognitive level. It might limit our ability to see things in various ways and to be flexible in the way that we can understand what's happening and respond to what's happening. So if there's emotional dysregulation and cognitive dysregulation, then clearly what happens with that in a transactional cycle is that there's then what we're going to call interpersonal dysregulation. Things don't go smoothly and or as planned. And part of what we're going to cover today is that means there's frequently anger, judgment, blame, criticism. All those things can be very corrosive to any kind of relationship. So friends, family, work relationships can start to be torn down through a process of lots of anger, blame, judgment, criticism. And then if this is something that somebody experiences repeatedly, and that's going to be one of the ways, how can we understand what's the difference between somebody who might meet the criteria for something like borderline personality disorder, is that these things would happen much more chronically and pervasively. We all at times become emotionally dysregulated, cognitively dysregulated, do things out of those states of dysregulation, causing problems and misunderstanding in relationships. But when this happens chronically, then the person's understanding of themselves is shaped by these kinds of historical patterns. And they begin to see themselves as potentially incapable of having successful relationships, incapable of successfully regulating their emotions, beginning to fear their emotions, beginning to fear the way that they think, and projecting into the future that this, once again, is going to go catastrophically wrong. And so therefore, maybe I just shouldn't even try. All right, so we have this as a kind of a broad base, one of the models, a core model that I'm going to refer back to. And then we have another core model that I'm going to refer back to, that as we discuss transactions, we can now start to illustrate, as these transactions occur, what are the components? Could we break this down into some kinds of core components, which then we could see and understand? Maybe then even be able to think about, on the one hand, maybe what we want to do is find out, are these things changeable? And sometimes we can directly say, okay, events, might be changeable. We might be able to avoid some avoidable suffering. We might be able to avoid some avoidable problems and arguments. And that also, that's not the full spectrum of what's going on, because one of the things I'm going to get to is that we are going to have judgments. That's one of the things that I want to illustrate for you very, very early on, is that we think a lot of thoughts. That's a very normal, natural human thing, that as our minds are faced with all of the stimulus coming at us every single day, that we're trying to make sense of it really instantly in the moments. So judgments occur, we categorize things, we judge things, we try to make them fit into kind of our, how do we understand this? How does it make sense? And then we have some type of emotional arousal often that then leads to these dysregulated behaviors. So one of the things I want to point out with this is how judgment sits right there, and that when something happens that we don't like, often the instant tendency is to judge both the event, but also to judge the kind of emotion that shows up. Because again, for many people, we were not raised in environments or cultures which really encouraged and supported and modeled for us that if fear or sadness shows up, to feel it, to experience it. And instead, what can happen is that we're often taught in sometimes subtle and sometimes direct ways to suppress certain emotions, to avoid certain emotions, to escape them, to distract from them. And what that ultimately creates is a wide spectrum over here on the right-hand side of what we're going to commonly call dysregulated behaviors. That people certainly communicate less effectively, and the two primary categories of that are listed at the top. That there can be angry outbursts or just withdrawal. Freezing somebody out. And again, that might come from an attempt to, I'm really trying to minimize the potential damage, so I'll just say nothing, I'll just leave. But that both withdrawal, silence, and isolation are hurtful to experience. Angry outbursts can be hurtful to experience. And that people do other things, lots of other behaviors, in an attempt to manage emotions that often feel really uncomfortable. So that's all part of this whole big picture, is what do any of us do when the uncomfortable shows up? What do any of us do when things don't go the way we want them to? And do we get really fixated on the idea of trying to really problem solve all of that? I'd like to expand this out a little bit more. And either Abby or Doreen, if either one of you could turn your cameras back on, that'd be much appreciated for me, so I could have some kind of feedback loop as to as there's an audience, and at least that the message is being transmitted. That would be helpful. And so there we go. Thank you for that. So if we move further than this as a way to say, what are the basic building blocks of what is happening in a transaction? We all face events. We all have the ability to potentially monitor and know our vulnerabilities, and know that in some moments we're going to be able to handle more than others. And that when people get emotionally aroused or emotionally dysregulated, they then communicate differently. The message comes out maybe not as precisely, not as accurately, and people start to express themselves in ways that might actually cause damage to relationships. And then in this moment, highlighted in red, what do we have is the environment then responds. So we can certainly be part of the environment to say, okay, I can react to pretty quickly and impulsively what often is really an inaccurate expression. Because in that inaccurate expression, again, things like withdrawal, isolation, silence, attacks, criticism, and blame can all be very hurtful to experience. Or we can try to use this model to understand that there's often something more going on than what the person is communicating directly. We can work on the assumption that people are really fully in control of their emotions, their vulnerabilities, they're aware of their judgments, and they're communicating accurately and effectively. Or we can realize that often when somebody lashes out or shuts down, they're not directly expressing the fact that they're hurt or they're scared or that they're embarrassed. But that as we move through this process, we start to discover that people aren't 100% perfect at expressing their emotions to us, and that we're often not perfect at expressing our emotions to other people. So lots and lots of opportunities for these transactions to be very, very invalidating. You're not understood. I'm not understood. So I think I wanted to maybe pause at this point just to check in to see if there's some obvious questions that are coming across, as these will become the foundational ideas before we add some of the new content.
Doreen, are there any questions that have come up?
Yes, so I think there have been some questions, Eric. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, it's kind of what's showing up what you're talking about, but I think a lot of people have always bring up when you start showing invalidating responses about validation, et cetera. So one of the questions is, how do you respond to the sentiment that validation represents weakness, laziness, et cetera? Especially, the trauma from the self-esteem movement. I like how they put that, of the 1990s, which provided harmful fake validation by downplaying failure, resulting in reactionary trigger for current attempts at legitimate validation. So I think, back when, I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, but when everyone was told, you're doing a great job and that's such a great effort and trophies for everything. And, but now people feel, it says, how do you respond to the sentiment that validation represents weakness, laziness, etc.?
I'm going to say that's clearly a different model than what I'm speaking of. That this is, we can use, and that's part of what we need to do is say, if we're going to use a word like validation, let's define it within the context as to how we're going to use it. So certainly validation is a broadly used term that could be defined in many, many kinds of ways. This really, really comes from a very specific model. This is one of the parts of family connections that's very deeply rooted in dialectical behavioral therapy, that has these really long scientific roots that go back into the 1980s and beyond, as to how do we effectively understand human behaviors? How do we become more effective at helping people who struggle with emotional dysregulation? So in this case, this is being module 4, and module 5 is going to really flesh out the, validation as a verb, what you do. That let's at least start with validation in the sense does mean validation is communicating to somebody understanding. And it doesn't mean that you agree with it. It doesn't mean I've taken the same opinion as you. It's not cheerleading. And this, in the sense that validation is a process, it's going to require often a back and forth transaction, multiple transactions, to get to the point of being able to understand, okay, there's some kind of kernel of truth in what this person is saying and or experiencing. And as we flesh this out today, that this is certainly not an all or nothing thing, where one person's stance is valid and one person's stance is not, that two people can differ and also both be true. There can be truth in both people's perspectives. So I'm going to say that validation in this case is more of an action that we do, an active attempt to understand, what is this other person experiencing? And that's going to be one of the stances that we can take that's going to stand in opposition to another position where we might operate on the assumption that this person is fully in control of what they're doing. Everything they're doing and saying is planned and deliberate, which then could easily be labeled as, well, they're manipulating me. They're lying to me. They're being antisocial again. There's all these labels that can emerge from that stance. So I think the question in itself is very, very valid. And another thing that we'll get into later on is we're going to talk about an idea of radical acceptance. That's also an idea that's broadly presented in lots of different places. So in this case, when we're saying, this is why I showed these slides as an attempt to proactively answer a question like this in this kind of model that involves emotions and judgments and the fact that people express themselves inaccurately and that we have vulnerabilities and they can be biological and they can be environmental, that it is difficult to understand what somebody else is experiencing without some kind of model like this. And validation is certainly not from this model, just saying to somebody, oh, okay, that's, yeah, I get it. Or that's, yeah, I agree. Or it's really more an active and attempt to understand these components. You have vulnerabilities, you face certain events, both historical and recent. You are having certain judgments, and those judgments might be very self-critical. You're trying to deal with emotions that are often hard to name and deal with. And then all of that creates inaccurate expression, which clearly sets up the opportunity for people to be misunderstood, for things to be missed. So some of the more traditional, some of the obvious things that we want people to recognize, what is obviously invalidating, telling somebody just flatly, no, that didn't happen, just be quiet. And there's a lot more other subtle forms of invalidation that really just come from, we're just not understanding each other. And that human communication breaks down incredibly easily, even under the best of conditions. And validation, it happens all the time.
Thank you, Eric. And someone asked, and I can just to remind everybody, what are some good questions to ask our loved one when their emotions are heightened, to even get to that point. And I just want to remind everybody that everyone here is an alumni, and there should be a validation handout that you should have received. And it does have the curious questions on there that you can ask. It's just a nice little handout for everyone to, so if you've forgotten about it, it should be in your material. So it's a nice thing to go ahead and reflect back on and go ahead and use. So I just wanted to remind people of that. And one other question, just with this slide being up, and I just want to remind people we can't answer all the questions. Some of them will be, we'll be typing back. It's just a lot, but it did say, which I think is a common question when we present this slide to people, Eric, is that how does, oh, I lost the question here. Hold on a second. I got some more. What I don't understand, this is what the person writes, is the emotion arousal. What I don't understand is the emotion arousal can be a result of an event without having any judgments before. My understanding following an event, the ideas that come to our mind results with a judgment, whether positive or negative. Following that judgments, the emotions arise. How can emotions arise without any judgment? And I think, from my understanding, there is a judgment that causes that heightened emotional arousal. So we have this event on that slide, and then it goes into heightened emotional arousal. And
so
it shows.
Here's what I'd like to point out. This is an oversimplified, linear-looking version of what happens. As if it goes this, then this, then this, sequentially. This is just a way to introduce what are the components involved. We have thoughts about thoughts. We have thoughts about emotions. Clearly, when it comes to the process of invalidation, one of the types of thoughts that we know we can look at, target, and say, we should be watching out for this, are going to be judgments. So as a starting point, some of the basic judgments are going to be the shoulds, I should, you should, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. So, so here's what I can do. One of an event, probably most people think of an external event. Something happened out there. I got cut off in traffic. Somebody hung up on the phone. The email was worded in a way that I thought it was offensive. There's those kinds of events. Or the other thing that we could do is place in that event marker any thought that we have or any emotion that we have. And that then becomes a starting point for this next cascade of we have emotions and thoughts, judgmental thoughts in reaction to external events, but all of the internal events that we have also then can create this cascade of judgments. So the judgments part is, I want to at least illustrate this. It is quite possible that as soon as something happens, we are thinking thoughts and or judgmental thoughts about what's happening externally and also what's happening internally. Like, oh, wow, I shouldn't be having this emotion. I shouldn't be letting this bother me. I'm getting frustrated with this person that I love. I should be more patient. So there's that whole avenue of so much of the judgment might be self-criticism. I shouldn't be feeling this feeling. I should be able to handle this better. I took family connections. I should just be able to respond like some kind of skills robot. And that's not going to happen, right? And I hope that I'm helping to flesh this out for people, because this is, every single slide that we're going to do is an oversimplification. It just gives us a starting point. But we have thoughts and emotions about, I mean, it just never stops. It just keeps going. So this is just a starting point. What are the kinds of things that we could pluck this out instead of this just being, it feels like this tidal wave of just stuff. Oh, okay. We could focus on judgments if we want to. We can focus on emotions and kind of learn the language of emotions. And then that opens up the possibilities of expressing ourselves more honestly and effectively and accurately if we know what's happening both inside of us and outside of us. And that could be maybe a definition of mindfulness. Do we know what's happening while it's happening inside us and outside of us? So I do know that we're at 2, which means that we have an additional hour. Should I add some new content? Yeah, and so I'm relying on both Doreen and Abby that if
you can move on.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll interrupt if needed. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I will try to pause after about every 5 or so slides, but also relying on you two to filter out the questions that are, I trust your judgment. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right. So here's one of these big questions in the email, in the invitation that went out as to what are we doing when we do something that's called a reboot of module 4. This is the top of the list of the 4 topics. What makes it difficult to be skillful? Well, what we're seeing on this list, we can map out on that diagram. What happens? Well, that people have severe individual distress, and that all of us over time develop habits and patterns. Habits and patterns of, those vulnerabilities. This is the reason why we talk about self-care so much. Managing your own emotions, managing your own health and well-being via self-care. So we could have patterns of self-neglect, skipping sleep, skipping meals, skipping social connection. But we also have habits and patterns that then flow out of us pretty automatically of what do we see, what do we notice, and how do we respond, what do we say. We might have automatic patterns of, instantly criticizing or instantly blaming. And then that can lead into certainly one of the emotions that we think and talk about a lot in family connections, particularly in this part of family connections, is anger. What do we do when we get uncomfortable? One of the things that people frequently do when they get uncomfortable is we go very quickly into how do I problem solve this? And I really think that's where a lot of the questions flow out of, is that people want the relatively quick boom, boom. Like when this happens, give me the script of what to do. How do I respond? And that's why, I think Family Connections, it takes 12 weeks and it takes ongoing practice, that often there's not that simple fill in the blank kind of answer. It's more of, oh, there's all these processes at work. There's all these various things to become aware of. And that if you become more aware of them, then in your particular situation, you can start to realize, oh, is it judgment? Is it anger? Is it invalidation? Is it the way I'm expressing myself? Is it how they're expressing themselves? Do I need more understanding of what BPD is? And then ultimately, at the end of this, we've got acceptance, right? This is the part of the conversation of today, is changing, fixing, controlling, problem solving is often the natural instinctive things to do when things aren't going as we want them to. How do I change this? But we don't get to fix and change everything. Sometimes this relatively automatic problem solving approach, an automatic fixing approach, is the problem. So sometimes problem solving is the problem. We don't have it within our power to actually control and fix everything. And so there's this other side that is, how do I accept, in particular, when I'm uncomfortable? All right. So that can all map out onto our diagrams. It now broadens the perspective of, once we identify anything, there's really two basic pathways that we can go. We really live in a problem-solving, change-based culture. It's probably highly likely that most of us have experienced or seen some kind of problem-solving, problem management type of training, either in school or on the job. This is talked about very frequently. Probably much less frequently is that one of the ways to try to work with a problem is to take an acceptance-based stance. So what can we do with any problem? We can work to solve it. So that is, there's this thing, I'm going to work directly with it and potentially change it. Or part of what we're talking about throughout Family Connections is recognizing we can work to more directly better understand and manage our own emotions, as opposed to trying to change something externally. Or we can accept it, and hopefully we're going to be able to flesh out, what does that mean and why is that so important? And there's always the option of staying miserable, or the second part of that, I think, is much more important, is that often people, when they are uncomfortable, will react impulsively with the intent of solving a problem, wanting to fix, wanting to control, wanting to make it better. And that actually makes things worse. So if we bring this model back up, what can we do? This is so much what we're talking about today. What can we do with judgments? We can try to fix them. We can try to solve them. You can try to just not have them, right? I know and have met really, really experienced mindfulness teachers. I'm a mindfulness teacher. I've met and had conversations with people that have been doing things like that for 40 years, 50 years. Never met a single person that was able to actually eliminate judgments. They happen quite naturally. We judge, we categorize, but we can certainly become more aware of our judgments. So that can be one of the things that we can do in terms of solving the problem of judgments. Well, we also have heightened emotions. We can try to fix and problem solve that, and we can try to do that proactively beforehand by practicing self-care. And this is where it gets really, really sticky, is that often what happens is that people do try to problem solve an emotion by pushing it away or trying to suppress it. So it's more so this internal landscape that I think this really, really applies at the deepest level for ourselves. What's some of the obvious things that we need to learn how to accept and tolerate is that we have thoughts and we have emotions. And we don't get to eliminate the uncomfortable ones. How do we work with the judgment when it shows up? How do we work with emotion when it does show up? So that we're also not constantly expressing ourselves inaccurately to others by acting as if I'm not really having the emotion that I'm actually having. So that to me is a deeper level of when we talk about ideas like radical acceptance. How is it the most relevant? It's not just about radically accepting somebody else. It's about radically accepting the fact that we are human. We have a full landscape of emotions. None of us will be perfect. None of us will always be skillful. We still will have judgmental thoughts. We still will get dysregulated. We still will express ourselves inaccurately at times, but we can work on it. We can actively try to work on managing that process. So it's not just this automatic flow down to, well, of course, we're creating invalidating responses if all that goes unchecked. So often, speaking of, what do we do with judgments? In Family Connections, we talk about the idea of relationship mindfulness. Relationship mindfulness is a specific way to tailor a way of thinking about mindfulness in general. And so part of the way we can start to work with the judgments is to realize, okay, judgments happen all the time. A judgment is a judgment. A thought is a thought and a judgment. They're not facts. They often are interpretations. They can be assumptions. They can be jumping to conclusions. There's many, many things that thoughts and judgments can be. And so noticing as we go through the world, interacting with everybody, that judgments show up. They just do. And what we're trying to do is to notice though, oh, okay, that is a judgment. That's a judgmental thought. So observing and describing is really, I think, out of all of the core skills, might be the singular core skill, to be able to separate out when a judgment does show up. I'm able to go, okay, I know it's a judgment. I don't have to believe it and I don't have to act on it. I don't have to allow that thought to control me and dominate me. And those thoughts like, why are they doing what they're doing? That's because they're trying to hurt me. They're trying to manipulate me. I mean, these are some classical examples of judgmental thoughts where we jump to conclusions. And then when we're able to observe and describe, and again, what are the kinds of things we'd be observing and describing? Well, we've got our full interior landscape to be able to gain skill at observing and describing. Yes, this is also a model to understand other people. Yeah, absolutely. But it's a model to understand people in general. And then we can more and more begin to observe and describe. All right, I want to give you one more idea and then I'm going to pause again. So here we go, radical acceptance. So here we have Marsha Linehan. So Marsha Linehan, if you don't know any of her background, she herself experiences emotional dysregulation throughout her early years and finds herself in an inpatient treatment center as a teenager, winds up being there for almost 18 months. And throughout the course of that experience, really creates this sense that if I am able to survive this, if I am able to understand this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it my life's mission to be able to help other people that have experienced this same kind of intense suffering, that then might result in things like, if it hurts this bad, if it hurts this bad, maybe I'd be willing to do damn near anything to make it stop. And so what she called that, she's called it multiple things, but some of the things in the family connections we talk about is we do have different sensitivities. And for some people that their emotional skin, it's as if their emotional skin is as if they have 3rd-degree burns, where almost anything, the very slightest movement of air, almost anything can activate the sensitivity and create this really intense pain. And what do we then do with that? So in order for us to move towards working with that effectively, that's hard to understand. So we get a model to understand that. And part of the radical acceptance is, while that is often just intensely painful to observe in somebody else that we love and care about, starting to recognize that trying to jump in and fix and control it actually sometimes makes it worse, actually sometimes creates more invalidation and more emotional dysregulation and more acting out behaviorally. So this is this radical, to her, Marcia likes the word radical. She was trained in radical behaviorism. She talks about radical genuineness. In this sense, it just means all the way to the core, all the way, fully accepting other people and ourselves. So I'm just going to illustrate. It's not the without judging. That's where I'm going to say, like, yes, once again, we've taken, Marcia writes extensively about acceptance and judgment, and all the ideas aren't captured within just that one sentence. We're going to judge. That's what I want you to hear from me. We will still judge. It's being able to recognize judgment as judgment. That's part of how we get to radical acceptance. So let me pause again just to see if there are specific questions that are coming up that seem to be at the core of what people want to know or talk about.
Yep. So, so one of the questions is, and I'd like to generalize the question, but how do you validate someone if other people around you, the specific questions as your spouse, if you're dealing with your kids, but I've heard it in many situations, is not on board with these perspectives. You know, do you pull the person aside and then validate them without that other person present? Or do you, you know, how do you handle all that?
Okay. So that is a good question. I can understand the dilemma in that. So again, to think about, these are skills that we can use with multiple people, right? So if other people in the family have a very different perspective, then we could also then take the skill of validation, which we're not going to fully flesh out today, right? That's going to be more of what happens in the next module in 5. We can understand and validate family members with a different perspective. We can validate somebody with BPD or chronic emotional dysregulation. And part of what DBT and Family Connections, I think, endorses is you do what works and do what's effective. And that if you're noticing that this is problematic to have these 3 different or 4 different perspectives in the same room, and we can't get them to gel, then you can't get them to gel. And maybe stop trying to get these people in the moment. Like, you've got a perspective and you've got a perspective. I am going to validate both of you simultaneously. That's like super high level skills. Now you're trying to validate multiple perspectives. And so if you have somebody who's chronically sensitive to invalidation, and you say, yep, I'm going to validate you, I understand you, and then you go, but I also agree with you too. What that might then do is then wipe away what just got validated for the person who's highly sensitive and say, now you're saying you understood me, but then you just immediately follow that up with this thing that negates that by agreeing with this person. So I think that is highly complex, and realizing that we can't always get a bunch of diverse people in the same room and get them all on the same page. So sometimes that validation is going to be more so, I need to have a one-on-one conversation with you for you to feel understood and validated, without a third party piping in and constantly saying, yeah, but what about this? But what about that? So I think we've identified what could be an obvious thing that might sabotage the ability to have somebody else feel heard and understood. And recognizing that if we have a bunch of people in the same room and they all have different perspectives, you might not be able to validate everybody at the same time as a group. That's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I want to point out to people who are asking questions, just a couple of things that in these webinars, we take one module at a time. A lot of people are asking about problem solving and everything. And
Sure.
so our questions that we answer are usually only about this material. So I know we're going to be missing a lot of answers in this, that people asking either about things that we're not talking about right now or their personal situations. So I apologize in advance if we can't answer all your questions. So I really think that, right now we're talking about this module and, somewhat about validation. You just talked about radical acceptance, but not problem solving. And I hope you continue to listen each month into those webinars. Thank you.
I do. So I think that's, to link it to what's obviously in front of us. This is the obvious place that most people are going to come from, is that, I have this problem. How do I fix and solve it right now? And radical acceptance, it's a little bit maybe antithetical to try to kind of digest that and take that in. That says, we can't fix and problem solve everything at once. You can't have all the answers at once. We can't cover all the material at once. Ultimately, what radical acceptance means a lot of times is that we will sit with discomfort. We will have to sit with discomfort as we figure out what to do next. But again, that can be, it's a whole own universe. And I wanted to, illustrate this because this is one of the times when Marcia's name and face and a quote is brought up within Family Connections, one of the few times. And also that plenty of other people use the word radical acceptance, use those phrases, and they might mean something slightly different. So again, we'll bring it back into the context of Family Connections and working with emotional dysregulation, that one of the things that occurs is, what are we radically accepting? We're radically accepting that sometimes that discomfort that I'm talking about is this sense of sadness and loss that comes from, this is not the way that I thought it was going to be. This maybe I'm needing to accept is never going to be the way I envisioned it at one point in time. So this is the thing. It's very normal and natural that all of us, we have a vision of what life is going to become, what a child is going to become, what a marriage is going to become, and we have preferences and wishes and wants. And then when we start to realize not all the things that we want are going to materialize, we start to experience the sense of sadness and grief. So this is another part of, well, what would we radically accept? We have to radically accept the fact that we experience sadness, which often people find to be quite uncomfortable. They often want to push it away, suppress it, avoid it. Certainly we live in a culture that gives us lots and lots of options, that if sadness does show up, that you could, if you wanted to, instantly distract yourself with shopping or Facebook or Instagram or Netflix or food or alcohol or workaholism, perfectionism. There's many things that we can also do to try to avoid uncomfortable emotions. So this is one of the elements of radical acceptance that are probably, to me, the most important to really understanding it. Why? Here's why. Again, we talk about emotions a lot. This is a conversation about emotions. Probably every single time that we talk about anything in family connections, we're having a conversation about emotions. So again, what happens? A primary emotion like sadness shows up, and then we push it away. Well, what does this do? It does a multitude of things. So sadness shows up and fear shows up as what we're going to call the primary emotion. Now, what's a primary emotion? A primary emotion is the normal, natural, instinctive response to whatever happens. So a normal, natural, biological response to losing someone or something, getting disconnected from someone or something that's important to us, is that we feel sadness, disappointment, grief. Again, that is incredibly uncomfortable for a lot of people. That has been shaped, reinforced in a certain way for a lot of people to get messages to not express sadness, to not feel sadness. And so what are we talking about? These are typical forms of invalidation that probably all of us have faced at one point in our lives, receiving the message to, hey, that emotion that you're feeling, go ahead and shut that down, because that makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't really like the presence of that strong emotion. And so that can then shape things over time so that people can start to pretty automatically shift out of every time these primary emotions show up, particularly the ones that are more vulnerable, the ones that it would take greater vulnerability to disclose to somebody else, to say to somebody, hey, you know what I'm experiencing right now? I'm actually afraid, or I'm actually scared, or I'm embarrassed by what I did. That can then start to shift things into anger. And anger starts to habitually show up as the quote, replacement emotion. So one of the things that somebody told me really early on that I found incredibly interesting and still valuable was, he said something like this: anger never comes to the party alone. So often that what is looking like and feeling like anger on the surface often has more vulnerable, raw emotions underneath of them: loss, grief, embarrassment, fear. And then what are we going to do with this information? You know, realizing that, coming back to at the very top of the hour, one of the very first things that we talked about is that in this transactional model, anger, judgment, blame, criticism is quite problematic in all kinds of relationships. That many relationships might eventually hit a breaking point if there's this kind of constant flow of blame and criticism. So even when it's justified, it can be very corrosive. And we're noticing that there are many reasons why all kinds of people might shift their expression into anger, judgment, blame, and criticism. Which, why is that important? Simple fact that it is destructive to a relationship. It breaks down relationships. So if we want to instead find some kind of pathway that's going to be less damaging to relationships and connection, managing, I think that's the word maybe I like better. We're going to learn how to manage judgment, manage anger when it shows up, understand it better, and maybe recognize if I'm expressing anger or someone else is expressing anger, what might be happening is that it's actually a secondary emotion, that something else is present. So here is clearly why, again, why would we target something like blame? Why would we target something like anger and judgments? Well, they often become a behavior. So one of the ways that people can communicate ineffectively is blame. Point the finger at somebody else. What does blaming do? It often perpetuates. If you send blame, you then receive blame. If you send criticism, you often then receive criticism. And so I think this is tremendous. Probably many of you have seen this before, but Brene Brown has many, many things that are out there in the world. She is a social worker, a professor, a researcher, has done lots and lots of clinical work that's incredibly relevant to the kinds of conversations that we have. And this is an excerpt that they've illustrated. I wish I could see everybody's faces, but I can't. So I'm just going to show you this little clip, and then we'll dissect some of these core elements.
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple of years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And the first, a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep into your home. And he got back like at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the no thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
All right, so that is the wonderful Brene Brown. So this gives us some detached perspective to think about a process that's not so close to home that it maybe overwhelms us. So you probably have your own version of Damn You, Steve. You have your own version of you just spilled coffee on yourself. And now what? And now what? It's a decision point. So one of the things that Brene helps to illustrate pretty well is that if we say decision point, okay, this is actually controllable. This is controllable, and that this is actually somebody's fault. I can focus my energies into identifying who's at fault and fixing the problem by addressing them. Or completely different perspective. I'm going to call it generically this thing called radical acceptance. You could say, oh, that just happened. I am now standing in my kitchen with coffee all over my shirt and pants. What am I going to do about that? Maybe I should change my clothes. Maybe I should try to clean the clothes that I have on. So in this moment of radically accepting, oh, that just happened, as opposed to getting angry and blaming and criticizing and fault finding, why radically accept? Because it opens up a pathway to effective action. How are we going to spend the energy that we have, which is all limited? You can blame, you can criticize, you can fault find. And I really like that she illustrates the idea that the why would we do this? Because it gives us some semblance of control. And if we often, if we stay hyper fixated on fault finding and problem solving, that's one pathway. And then there's also the other pathway of you're standing in your kitchen covered in coffee. What are you going to do next? What do you need to do next? Metaphorically speaking, what do you need to do next? Well, that depends on what kind of person do you want to be and what kind of life do you want to have. And so that's why this thing I think is tough, is we want these like relatively straightforward answers that feel like a multiple choice test of when this situation shows up, what do I do or say? And this is more of, it's a long sequence of skills and principles that all work together collectively that you have to practice again and again and again to be able to get that answer of, it's more of, what do I do in this unique moment that's going to be more effective, that's going to be based more on skill and not automatic pilot or not emotional reactivity. There's no perfect. And that's, I think when we talk about the idea of radical acceptance, that's at the core of it, is we're not going to have all the answers, radically accepting that. We're not going to be perfect at this. We're not going to be always skillful at this. But we can try to operate with intention and skill more regularly. And probably nobody will do this all the time. All right. So there actually are options to blaming. Oh, so one of which is that, oh, that just happened kind of stance of, all right, let me see very, very clearly what's the situation that I'm in. Let me radically accept it, burn up as little energy as possible about criticizing myself, trying to time travel back to, if I would have done this other thing 5 days ago, then this would be different. But to say, okay, this actually has happened. Now what do I do to be effective? And this is coming back to some of these what I call core mindfulness skills. The previous slide that said, instead of judging, what are we trying to do in its place? Observe and describe factually. I am covered in coffee. Now what? There's also then, how can I understand the other people's situation and know that two people doing the same thing at the same time in the same place are actually having two different experiences because that internal landscape is different. They're having a different set of thoughts. They're having a different set of emotions. They have a different set of expectations. And so part of this, why radically accept? Because it actually is a pathway to suffer less and to have a greater quality of life. That radical acceptance is not this passive resignation of, oh, okay, there's just nothing I can do about it. It's recognizing when non-acceptance actually bumps up your suffering. So pain plus non-acceptance. So we can get all into in the coffee. Yes, there's coffee. Maybe the clothes are stained. Maybe the clothes are ruined. Nobody wants that. Nobody envisions that for their morning. Then we could bump it up of, okay, there's the pain of there's coffee on my clothes. Let me now call up somebody I love and say things to them which I'll later regret. That'll hurt their feelings. So there's that kind of, we can now turn pain into suffering. And so this math equation at the bottom of the slide is a way to understand why acceptance. Why is there this talk about there's change in acceptance? Because being able to recognize the moments when non-acceptance is actually exacerbating your pain. Some pain is unavoidable. Physical pain, that we will get sick, that we will get older, that we will have losses. And to try to disengage as quickly as possible when we are then adding to the pain in all the various ways that you can, particularly blaming and criticizing, not just somebody else, but yourself. I shouldn't have done that. I should have known better. I'm an idiot. I'm so stupid. I do this all the time. That's turning pain into suffering. So let me pause once again to see if there are some questions that maybe, or a question that we could pluck out. And if not, then I'll just keep going.
Hi. One person asks, how do you develop the skill of radical acceptance of behaviors that can cause you to become dysregulated?
I guess I'm wondering, are we talking about somebody else's?
Yeah, so I guess
Yeah.
it's, if I'm taking it as if we're the family member and we're trying to radically accept certain things about our person or our situation, how do we radically accept a behavior that can cause you yourself to become dysregulated?
So here's what I'm going to do is, let me back up to this, right? And we're going to say, okay, let's say in this instance, the event that we're talking about is somebody else's behaviors. Or it could be the behavior of you just spilled coffee on yourself. Let's make it a little more egregious. Somebody just threw coffee on you. A lot of people would get dysregulated if somebody threw coffee on you. So then what happens? Well, nobody wants that, right? There's a certain amount of discomfort that's already built into the situation. There's this thing that they're doing and I don't like it. That's more this mindfully observing and describing. They're doing something and I don't like it. They're doing something and they're a jerk is now adding judgment. I'm doing something and I'm a jerk is now adding judgment. They shouldn't do that and I shouldn't respond this way. They shouldn't talk to me this way and I shouldn't talk back to them this way, are all these additional layers of judgment that we could add into. So every single time that somebody else does something that we don't like, we can start to recognize how much of this is this thing in my head, this little judgmental voice that kicks in often automatically and goes, boy, that was stupid. That was rude. That was awful. That was terrible. That was disrespectful. So again, there's components to why are we uncomfortable? There's an event. Somebody does something. We have an emotional response. In between that, there's also probably some judgmental thoughts about what they did and also what we think and feel. So for the coffee version, it would be, oh, that just happened. They just did that. They called me a name, or they threw coffee at me. That just happened. Now what do I do to respond to it effectively? So the whole thing with the judgments is they can sweep us up. We get carried away in the judgment of, here's the judgmental voice. You can't do that. You can't do that, or you shouldn't do that to me. And then the response flows out of judgment about what happened as opposed to what happened.
I think also that, we come back to radical acceptance. Again, these are in other modules, but we want to try the validation first. We want to try collaborative problem solving before we just accept what's happening. I think it's when radical acceptance happens when we've tried to solve the problem, we've tried to guide, we've tried to validate, and it doesn't work. So hopefully everyone's using those skills first before having to come back. You have to use radical acceptance first, go to those other skills, and then come back to it only if needed too. Do you agree, Eric?
And just to clarify, when I'm saying radical acceptance, it's really just, can I see things clearly as they have occurred, and not get caught up in this additional set of lenses, which are the judgments, which can then prevent us from actually, like, how am I going to interact with what's happening effectively? I have to actually understand what's happening. I have to have this legitimate awareness that's based on the facts of what's occurred, as opposed to my opinions, my judgments, my assumptions of what should or should not be. So it's a way of like slowing down our own reactivity. Radical acceptance is just, in this instance, is let me try to tease out and separate, oh, those are judgments. Not radical acceptance meaning like, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. The kind of radical acceptance that opens up the possibility of, how do I now work with and respond to what has occurred? Not just flowing out of a filter of a lot of self-critical or other critical judgments and blame. All right, so
Eric, can I ask you a question about blame? That's we have a couple people who asked.
yeah.
One person said, and we have a couple that are similar, what you're describing regarding blame is what my loved one with BPD needs to learn. How do I react when I get caught in her blaming? So what do I do when I see them blaming?
Okay. So another reason why I like this particular video is because this has played out in my own household. So sometimes Family Connections has information that we would just love it if other people got access to the same stuff, right? So as we get exposed, maybe finding the right timing in the right moment to say to somebody, not when we're trying to fix and problem solve them because we're having an issue with what they've done or said and we don't like it. But when the space presents itself to be able to say, hey, you know what? I saw this thing. It's a video. It's only about 2.5 minutes. I'd love it if you watched it. Would you be willing to watch it? And so this clip from Brene Brown, actually dating back to before the video, has really helped me and my wife identify some things that play out in our household sometimes. A process of automatic blame. And that sometimes if somebody's getting blamed, what's actually going on at a deeper level is there's other emotions, and that the anger and the blame actually is a secondary emotion. So I think the bigger conversation about that question is finding the opportunities, not as an attempt to problem solve or to be right. Hey, you're doing this thing that I don't like again. You need to hear this from a different source besides myself. as opposed to that, in the calmer, paused moments of the relationship where there can be a conversation, there's this thing I would like you to look at, and I would like for us to think and talk about it together. So that's its whole own skill set that I think we can address more in module 5 and 6, as you get a script on how to have conversations with dear man skills. I think those kinds of requests on there's this thing I would love it if you would check out, can go right into the structure of dear man. And the dear man, of course, is much more effective if you're able to be mindful and if you're able to do validation. So all these things do go hand in hand. I hope that that's helpful. That seems to be the practical wisdom that emerges from teaching family connections, is you have to learn how to pick your spots when the timing is right and things are calmer and you're getting along better, to say, there's some information I would like to show you that somebody showed me that I found to be interesting or helpful. And I think it would be, again, if it really is just coming back to you want to fix and problem solve them, that then is probably going to be received as pretty invalidating. Is that helpful? Okay. So there are a few more ideas in the 10 minutes that we have left, as a way to extend this. So this is the last little piece that we covered, thinking about, some of what's the value of acceptance, because it's actually a pathway to having less pain and suffering in your life. And what are we doing in terms of a no blame alternative? That, again, this is an ongoing process, recognizing the transactional nature. If we're able to assist somebody else in managing their own emotions, that then can in turn help us to experience less distress. So that's some of the real, directly what's in it for me. Why would I learn how to validate somebody else? Why would I bother to expend the energy to validate somebody else, when I'll be quite frank with you, sometimes I don't want to do it either. I would much rather just prefer, why do I have to, I think those thoughts too. Why do I have to deal with this right now? Why aren't you doing the same work I'm doing? Why aren't you more skillful? Well, in that moment, those are more examples of these judgmental thoughts that we know are pulling us out of radical acceptance. It is happening. They are doing it. Now we have to decide, how do I want to interact with it? So overall, we can talk about this idea of change and acceptance. So this slide actually first appears in Family Connections all the way back in module 1 and reappears now in 4, is we very much today thought about our thoughts. We thought about our thoughts. We're trying to become more aware of our thoughts as we're having them, so they don't take us for a ride. They're not always 100% accurate. They're not always 100% going to take us in the direction that we want to in terms of having the kind of life. So we operate on assumptions all the time. Here's a different kind of assumption. And here's the thing, I can't prove it to you that it's a fact. It's just, here's another assumption you could operate from that might make this more manageable. You could try to imagine what we call a more benign assumption, meaning if you don't know, you're not 100% sure, what if you gave them the benefit of the doubt? A lot of that is going to come down to being able to radically accept, saying to yourself again and again and again, I don't know. I don't know for 100% certainly exactly what they're thinking, exactly what they're feeling, or exactly what they intended. And the only way to get access to people's thoughts, feelings, and intentions are to actually have this back and forth transactional conversation. So we have that we're certainly operating off of assumptions. This is just a different set of assumptions to operate off of. The benign, maybe they weren't intentional. Maybe it wasn't their attempt to cause me harm. It's not personal. Those would be examples of benign interpretations. And then here at the bottom, this is a very interesting set of assumptions to operate off of, because this really represents great flexibility to be able to hold two things that seem like they're contrasting ideas as both being true. That everybody involved, us, them, the treatment providers, the people at Family Connections, the people at NEABPD, maybe even the insurance companies and hospitals, everybody involved is trying to do the best that they can in this moment and even wants to get better. And everybody needs to work harder and be more effective and be more skillful. So this is a what can I do instead of blaming? You're doing the best that you can. I'm doing the best that I can. I need to work harder. You need to work harder in order for this to get better. It's a different kind of a thinking process called a dialectical thinking process. This is the dialectic is these in DBT, the treatment DBT. It really is reflective of how do we continually find some way to have balance. In particular, things that would seem to be opposites that might negate each other. So here's another theme of balance that runs throughout Family Connections, that we can both invest time and energy in taking care of others and taking care of ourselves, practicing self-care, practicing other care, trying to be less judgmental and kinder to others and being less judgmental and kinder to ourselves. So this is one of the many forms of balance or dialectical thinking, that both of these things can be true. Hopefully at this point, based on prior exposure, you got exposed to this concept as well, the wise mind concept. One of the core ways that this sense of balance could be visually represented, that we have two things that can coexist simultaneously, where one doesn't negate the other one doesn't wipe the other one out. They both are still here. We can be both emotional and rational at the same time. And that finding the synthesis, that's the word, right? If there's one single word, we can synthesize things which seem to be opposite. What you are saying is true, and what I am saying is true. And looking for there's something I'm missing, there's something I'm not understanding, being willing to continue to search to say, instead of jumping to the conclusion or the assumption that what they're doing is just a lie or just a manipulation, or they're just nuts, being able to say, there's some kind of kernel and truth in what they're saying and what they're feeling. Let me try to search for it. That becomes the essence of what validation is. That becomes much more the landscape, the how to do it. But today's setup was how to create more validating environments. And hopefully we've been able to flesh out a lot of that. This is going to be just one of a sampling of many things where we can say these dialectical tensions. Acceptance and change, yes. Problem solving, validating. Well, they actually go hand in hand. One doesn't negate the other one, where we got to pick, it's this or that. One actually creates the possibility for the other. We are very, very close to the end of our allotted time. I just wanted to pause to say, are there additional messages maybe from the NEA or questions that you wanted me to potentially address in our last few minutes?
I think we were able to answer most questions, either asking or answering ourselves. And I know it's always not perfect when we're answering questions and trying to interrupt, et cetera. So I'm sorry if I think we got to all the questions, but everyone I think we're getting so much out here of um, saying excellent. Excellent. Oh my gosh, I'm just fumbling words here. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. And I think Abby, if everyone can take a look in the chat really quickly before this ends, is that Abby did put in the webinar link that has all of our previous webinars. And when yours is finally up in the cloud, we can add that in. And so if you want to look at previous, we have done radical acceptance, we have done other skills. And so I highly suggest, if you're new to this, or even if you have seen previous presentations, that you click on that link. So you have to scroll really quickly before this ends up there to click on that. But it's if you go into borderlinepersonalities.org, and then anyway, try to look it up. I was just going to try to say it, but I think it's too much. So Abby, did you have anything else to add?
So the other link that I just put on was our Facebook page. We do have a Facebook group for alumni. And if you would like more detailed answers about your question or to ask a question, please feel free to post it on our Facebook page. We have leaders who monitor it, and you can also get feedback from other participants. So we hope that we were able to answer as many questions as possible. But again, if you have additional ones, please feel free to post them. And a huge thank you to Eric. This was fantastic. We are getting so many wonderful comments coming through on the screen. And also wanted to thank Doreen for her time and helping to run this, and Jean, who is behind the scenes and was helping to answer some questions. So we're really, it's a community, we're a family, and it takes all of us to put these on. So we thank everybody for all their help and support.
And next month I'll be doing validation, so hope you'll be able to join in. Then we'll get a little bit more into that skill. Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks again, Eric. I agree with Abby. It was great.
Can I do one last closing thought?
Sure, go for it.
We've covered a lot of ground in terms of concepts and ideas. The Family Connections does focus on the idea of education and information, but also the implementation of skills. So please, please, please think about chances to practice this in real life settings with real people. It doesn't have to be with the person that you find to be particularly challenging at the moment. So that's really where the change will happen, is practice these things. Ways to understand what's happening and how can I respond differently. So
Yeah,
the stuff is more available when you need the most. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I can't agree with you more. I tell my own participants when I teach, practice on the cashier at Target, the guy pumping your gas, your coworker, anything, because when you get skilled, better at these skills with other people in regulated moments, it'll be easier to use those skills when it's heated. So perfect way to end that, Eric. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.